Hi, this is Jen Rubin, editor-in-chief of the Contrarian. We have back with us to discuss the most amazing legal developments we have seen, even in a most amazing legal time. Andrew Weissman, thanks so much for joining us, Andrew.
I always say the same thing when I say it's not good to be here, and yet it's good to be here.
Very good. We have seen the most remarkable development, legally, politically, but I'd like to hone in on a specific aspect of this crisis and understanding that Trump has not only nationalized the National Guard, but he is deploying the US Marines to California. Let's start with something that's not really a legal issue, but it's kind of a basic issue. Historically and practically, why don't we want the military doing police work, doing patrolling of the streets of major cities?
Well, you know who was like a huge proponent of making sure that we had civilian control in this country was President Eisenhower. And so, it was obviously General Eisenhower, and he understood that. And it's gone back through centuries of in this country that, and by the way, I'm saying that with understanding that the military in many ways is quite law-abiding and has very strong rules about what they can do. But that's true of civilian law enforcement authorities, and we are a civilian country. This is not a military dictatorship. As we are doing this, Jen, there are 4,700 people who have been deployed by this administration in California. 4,000 National Guard who've been federalized, and 700 Marines. That number may go up, it may go down. That is extraordinary when, by all accounts, and I don't know if you have the data, but I'm not sure that's even close to, like, when you think about the number of people who have been violent during any sort of demonstration, it's nothing even close to that number. It's just a tiny fraction. So it seems like a real overreaction. This is where something that you're sort of implicit in your question is something I dealt with when I was at the FBI, which is the judgment call. Even if this was lawful, and I think there's substantial questions about whether this meets the prerequisites of the statute. But even if you did meet them, which, by the way, requires an invasion, a rebellion, or an inability to carry out federal law enforcement functions, and it requires the order to have been given by the governor. So I don't see any of those prerequisites being met here. So that's sort of the legal issue. But even if you thought you could do that, and this is where the invasion and rebellion piece, and even the sort of, can you not accomplish your goals? That's where you would say, tell me about the fit between the peaceful demonstrators and the violence you're seeing. In other words, are we just talking about like a handful of people, but the vast majority are not? Like, what is it that you're saying is an invasion? What is it that you're saying is a rebellion? And it's worth pointing out two other things. One, the president does not make any findings when he issued this order. It doesn't say this is why. He also doesn't say that his order is just about California. This could be for the entire country. And so, of course, he doesn't have any findings because nothing's happening in the rest of the country. And yet this order, I want to make sure everyone understands, it applies nationally, not just in California. That is the scary part. And then the thing that I would argue if I were Gavin Newsom and California, I would say, you'd like to talk to me about invasion and rebellion? I'd like you to tell me how what we are seeing in California is worse than what happened on January 6th, where you say that was not in any way a rebellion, right? I mean, that's supposed to be like this great event. That qualifies a whole lot more as some kind of insurrection or rebellion or invasion of the, the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers. I mean, I'm not sure I would say any of that, but the point is, since this administration has said that's sort of this wonderful day, the glorious day for this country, and it was a grave injustice that those people were prosecuted. If that's their position, how can they turn around and say this is warranted either legally or just as a policy matter? So it just reads as a total pretext to send in the Marines.
And the Marines, getting back to our policy issue, this is not what they're trained to do. As I have put it to our listeners and readers, the law enforcement's job is to de-escalate. Marines escalate because they're in the job of killing and breaking things in defense of our country and our Constitution. They seem completely mismatched to the task at hand.
I think that's right. I mean, I do think that there probably are certain circumstances where Marines, um, take necessary force, and then once the situation is resolved or safe enough that they do de-escalate. But they're not trained with civilian populations to deal with first American law. I mean,
Yes.
FBI agents are trained. They have training on American law, what's required. They go to court. They deal with prosecutors. I mean, that the same thing happens at the state level. That is not what we expect of, and that's not what we have trained people in the military to do. They are trained on a whole variety. Just to be clear, I'm like a big fan of the military that when it's properly trained. It's just that we're putting them in a position that they are not, that's not their primary duty. And so, you wouldn't send in a musician to do brain surgery.
Now, one of the caveats that Trump has put in there, and it's very vague and non-specific, is that both the Marines and the National Guard are supposed to be there for the purpose of defending personnel and federal property. What's the legal reason he put that in? And what the heck are they actually doing? Since I haven't seen, attacks on ICE agents of any nature. There's no federal buildings that have been attacked. What is it that they're supposed to be doing?
So the reason I would suspect that he put that in, I mean, again, I don't know what was in his head, but there is a criminal law called the Posse Comitatus Act, and it makes it a crime with certain exceptions, but this is not one of them. It makes it a crime to send in the military to do law enforcement activities. So traditional law enforcement, arrests, searches, prosecutions, those kinds of things. Unless there's an exception, that has been criminalized. And so this, a good example, by the way, is in the Gavin Newsom state of California civil complaint that has just been filed yesterday, where they say the only other time that this law has specifically been invoked and exclusively invoked is when President Nixon used it to have the National Guard help out when there was a postal strike. That gives I think all of our listeners a sense of like, that's not law enforcement activity. That is having them help out on something because you need more people power to get it done.
Right.
But it's not a law enforcement activity. This is the reverse, and the problem is it's so much in the eye of the beholder what it could be, because you could imagine them thinking, we're going to get to detain people because we want to make sure that the area is safe. So we're going to start seizing people. Well, that's a Fourth Amendment issue when you start seizing people with no due process, no probable cause. That's physically putting your hands on people. That's a big deal under the Constitution, and there's a lot of restrictions. And so, if you're doing that just to make sure ICE can do their work, is that something that is not law enforcement activity? It certainly looks like a seizure. And so that issue of the fuzziness of it is the kind of thing that I I will say when I was at the FBI, one of the things that I worried about was not just having clear rules for my folks, but having rules that could be sufficiently not just clear, but sufficiently removed from the legal lines that there was a buffer. Because when you
Yes.
have 30,000 people, people are going to spill over, and you don't want people's rights to be violated. And here, that fuzziness is the kind of thing that, if let's just say if I were the general counsel of ICE, I would be extremely worried about, assuming you have a agency where they are focusing on that issue, which of course they should be.
One of the things that we began with was the person that understood this division between civil and military force was General Eisenhower. Now, he did use the military very famously, but talk about how that was so different and the purposes and the deployment was so different than what we are seeing now.
Sure. So just to be clear, he also was using a different statute. And so
Correct.
statutes matter because,
Yes.
we're a nation of laws, and you look at the different statutes and so everyone agreed that he could use it. But so for instance, if you are sending in federal law enforcement or federal military to do a law enforcement related function, you can imagine a situation which happened in our country where the Supreme Court said there is no longer going to be segregation in the South, and there were states that were violently opposed to it, and there was huge concerns about governors who were not just saying we're not going to help, but they were sort of actively against that. You had a real concern about violence and protecting people go to school. And so there would be desegregation. That is a very different context than something where you're worried about people being seized and prosecuted in connection with demonstrations, protected First Amendment activity, which this would chill. They're not being sent in to promote the First Amendment activity. In fact, they could care less about that, it seems. What they're really focused on is these immigration raids, many of which, by the way, are being carried out. I shouldn't say many, which we know from court cases include agents doing this while they are masked.
Yes.
Just to give you an idea of the terror that is, to my mind, being deliberately engendered. Jen, I just want to make sure people know that does not happen. Agents do not routinely wear masks. In COVID, yes, but before and after COVID, no. The idea that you're putting your face behind this mask so that you cannot be identified for what? You should be assuming you are doing something lawful, and you shouldn't be worried about being called out for it, because you can then just defend it.
Right.
So it
Right.
is, I mean, it's deliberately scary. And so I just think it's very much apples and oranges. But I think it's important for people to know that there can be, we are not in a situation where the federal government has no role under any circumstances
Right.
to enforce its laws and to protect people, even if the state disagrees.
Right. Now, as the days pass and it becomes evidence, it's not just isolated violence, but no violence whatsoever. What happens to whatever authority he thinks he has, Donald Trump, in deploying the Marines, in deploying the National Guard? Are they now going to simply occupy US cities and leave them there? What's the basis for doing that?
Yeah, so the president's order says it's going to be for 60 days, or at the Secretary of Defense's discretion. Good luck with that. But the thing is, the statute requires these findings of, let's leave aside the governor's giving the order, but you need
Right.
to have a finding of rebellion, invasion, or not being able to carry out the laws. So as time dissipates, I mean, that's where I think the lawsuit becomes a lot more meritorious because they're going to have to say how those, even if you could say they existed at time one, you're going to need to be able to say why it's true at time two. It doesn't mean because you have time one, you get to do it in perpetuity.
And one of the things that's, of course, contradictory among many things is Donald Trump says he has saved the city. He's put things back to order. Well, you can't have it both ways. You can't say, well, see, ICE is doing its job. We're back in command,
Great point.
and we need the National Guard and the military to remain there. You're either in control or you're not in control. And it would seem that Trump can't continue to plead that, in essence, the federal government can't do its job under his administration. Therefore, you need the military to come in and help him do it. So at some point, I think this is going to clash is going to happen. So let's end on this, not small, but ultimately critical issue. Are the courts going to want to wade into this? Is this the classic political question? Is this the, political question? Or are the courts going to do as they've done in the Alien and Sedition Act, the Alien and Enemies Act, which is say, no, you don't get to decide if a statute applies. We do. We're the courts.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think I'm going to give a terrible lawyer's answer, which is sort of yes and no, which is I think that the courts are going to defer where there has been supported factual conclusions by the administration. So, but that when I say that, they can't just say there's a rebellion, there's invasion. But if they say, look, this is why we're doing it, and here's the facts to support it, I can see the court saying, we're going to defer to that factual assessment. But, and this is where it's exactly like the Alien Enemies Act litigation, the court has been very strong on saying, we, the courts decide what is a rebellion. We decide what is an invasion. And then whether what you say factually has happened, we will map that to see whether it fits the definition of a rebellion. Guess what? A rebellion is not a few people protesting on the street, even if violent. That's deplorable, just to be clear. That's not a good thing, but that's not a rebellion. And that's not an invasion. And on the Alien Enemies Act, I think we're up to 4 federal cases that have said this does not meet that statute. And that's because they can defer to the factual findings, but they can say it just doesn't meet what we say is the definition that Congress intended.
Well, let's hope. The Northern District of California, where this was filed, an interesting choice of jurisdiction, which we'll leave for another day, that did not file in Los Angeles, in the Central District. Venue is always very important in these decisions in law enforcement. But we're going to follow this. And Andrew, thank you so much for your expertise. It's great to have someone who actually was in charge of setting the rules for law enforcement as you were as general counsel, because I think what we have is an absence of rule setting in this administration, which is incredibly dangerous. And relying on the discretion of Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth is, cause for panic. So
well,
thank you so much.